Imagine being a teenager, crowned king of a realm teetering on the brink of collapse. That was the reality for Baldwin IV, who ascended to the throne of Jerusalem during one of its most desperate hours. He didn't just inherit a crown, he inherited a kingdom riddled with division, surrounded by enemies, and a body afflicted by the relentless advance of leprosy. The recent death of his father, King Almaric I, had ripped open old wounds among the Crusader nobility. Factions immediately began circling, vying for power and influence over the young ailing monarch. The court was a viper's nest of ambition and intrigue, but the political games at home were nothing compared to the storm gathering on the horizon. A new power had risen in the east, a leader of extraordinary vision and military genius, Saladin, having united the rival powers of Egypt and Syria under his banner. Saladin commanded a vast, disciplined, and fiercely motivated army. His goal was singular and clear: to drive the Christian Crusaders from the Holy Land and reclaim Jerusalem. For the Kingdom of Jerusalem, this was an existential threat, unlike anything they had ever faced. Baldwin's illness only made the situation more precarious. Ambitious nobles saw his physical weakness as an opportunity, a chance to seize control and steer the kingdom for their own gain. The royal court fractured into two primary camps. One, led by the pragmatic Raymond III of Tripoli, argued for cautious diplomacy and strategic patience. The other, more aggressive faction, championed by figures like Guy de Lusignan, pushed for immediate, decisive military action. Trapped between these rivalries, the young king had to learn to navigate the treacherous currents of his own court to simply hold his kingdom together. Yet, despite his youth and his debilitating illness, Baldwin was about to prove that his spirit was far stronger than anyone, especially his enemies, could have ever imagined. Faced with the overwhelming might of Saladin, Baldwin understood that a head-on confrontation would be suicide. He was a pragmatist, not a fool. His strategy wasn't about winning a single glorious battle, but about buying the one thing his kingdom needed most: time. He needed time to heal the divisions in his court, time to strengthen his defenses, and time to prepare his people for the inevitable war. One of his first and most crucial moves was to negotiate a temporary truce with Saladin himself. This ceasefire was a masterstroke of diplomacy. It provided a much-needed period of relative peace, a breathing spell for the embattled kingdom. Saladin, for his part, also benefited, using the lull to consolidate his own power across his newly united empire without the distraction of a Crusader war. Baldwin put this precious time to good use. He began a sweeping reorganization of his army, drilling his troops and honing their skills. He poured resources into reinforcing the kingdom's network of castles and fortifications, turning them into formidable bastions of defense. He also looked beyond his own borders for help. Maintaining a strong alliance with the powerful Byzantine Empire was a top priority, as their naval and financial support was crucial. Simultaneously, he dispatched envoys to Western Europe. making passionate appeals to the Pope and the great monarchs of Christendom for knights and funds. But aid from the West was always a gamble's load to arrive, if it arrived at all. Baldwin knew the truce was a temporary shield, not a permanent solution. Every day of peace was a day Saladin used to build his own strength, to gather more soldiers, and to solidify his control over the region. The clock was ticking. The confrontation was coming. It was no longer a question of asterisk, if asterisk, but asterisk, when asterisk. And Baldwin knew he would need more than just clever diplomacy. He would need immense courage and military prowess to stand against the storm. To understand the immense pressure on Baldwin, we need to look at the kingdom's fragile economy. Jerusalem's wealth flowed primarily from trade routes that crisscrossed the region, but these same routes were constantly vulnerable to raids. Taxes on local populations and agriculture brought in revenue, but it was never enough to fund the constant military readiness the kingdom required. The Crusader army, while composed of some of the finest knights in the world, was dangerously small. They were perpetually outnumbered and heavily dependent on reinforcements from Europe, reinforcements that were unreliable and often too little, too late. The daily struggle to field a standing army and keep the treasury from running dry was a constant, grinding battle for Baldwin. In this struggle, the military orders, the Knights Templar and the Knights Hospitaller, were the backbone of Jerusalem's defense. These warrior monks were the kingdom's elite special forces. They provided disciplined, battle-hardened knights, controlled a string of vital fortresses, and often led daring raids and patrols deep into enemy territory. They were indispensable. However, their power came with a price. The orders were largely autonomous, often acting on their own initiative, which created friction with the king and the established nobility. The Templars in particular were known for their independent and sometimes reckless actions, which could complicate the king's delicate diplomatic strategies. To make matters worse, a deep-seated rivalry simmered between the Templars and the Hospitallers, further fracturing the kingdom's already fragile political landscape. Meanwhile, the court remained a battleground of conflicting ideologies. Raymond of Tripoli continued to advocate for a defensive diplomatic strategy to contain Saladin. But a powerful war faction, closely aligned with the Templars and figures like Reynaud de Chatillon, pushed for aggressive, preemptive strikes. They believed that only by showing strength could they deter Saladin. Caught in the middle were influential figures like Baldwin's own mother, Queen Maria Comnene, and her husband, Balian of Ibelin. They sought a moderate path, trying to stabilize the kingdom from within and prevent the rival factions from tearing it apart. Baldwin had to masterfully balance these competing interests. He knew that a civil war, a collapse from within, was just as great a threat as Saladin's armies massing at the borders. While Baldwin navigated his internal chaos, Saladin's power grew to its zenith. Under the banner of the Ayyubid dynasty, he had successfully unified Egypt and Syria, bringing both Sunni and Shia Muslims under his rule, a feat few had accomplished. He subdued rebellious local emirs and forged a unified Islamic front. From his perspective, the Crusader states were the final intrusive barrier to complete Islamic dominance in the Near East. With his power consolidated, he began to probe the kingdom's defenses. He launched a series of coordinated offensives against the crucial Crusader fortresses in the Transjordan, the arid lands east of the Jordan River. These castles, like the mighty Karak and Montreal, were the kingdom's eastern shield, and their fall would open a direct path to Jerusalem. The threat was immediate and undeniable. In response, Baldwin sprang into action. He personally led reinforcements to the threatened border garrisons, increasing patrols and putting the entire kingdom on high alert. Every available knight was mobilized. The military orders were deployed to their forward positions, their banners flying from the ramparts of the most critical fortresses. Desperate messages were sent once again to Europe, begging for immediate aid. The fragile peace, bought with such careful diplomacy, was shattered. The time for negotiation was over. The Great War for the Holy Land had begun.